Good evening. Members of the Rectorate, members of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences Management Team, special guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a wonderful honor to have you here this evening for the professional inaugural lecture of Professor James Warwick, and it's professorial, sorry. We hope that you enjoy this evening with us. Please rise for the entrance of the academic procession.
You may be seated. Good evening, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karen Bartjes. I am the Vice Dean for Learning and Teaching at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences here at Stellenbosch University. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone present as well as online this evening on this wonderful occasion where we celebrate Prof. James Warwick's professorships. A special word of welcome to Prof. Nicholas Smith, Acting Chief Operating Officer, Professor Richard Stevens, Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor Learning and Teaching, and Prof. Bertie Fielding, the Dean of Science. And of course, our candidate, James Warwick. A special word of welcome to Prof. Warwick's special guests, including his wife Laurie, son Scott, and daughter Emily. We also welcome guests from outside the Stellenbosch University community, our colleagues from Stellenbosch campus, and from within the faculty. As you know, the inaugural lectures are an important and central part of our university's academic life. We commemorate the lecturer's appointment to full professorship, and this is a very important and defining moment in the career of an academic. It is also a very important and joyous event in our academic calendar, as it says that you've made a significant contribution to your field of science and your field of research and academy. An inaugural lecture provides a platform for the candidate to tell us and share with us who they are and present the body of research that they have been focusing on during their career. It is thus a celebration of achievement. It's a celebration of academic recognition, and we are honored to be here this evening to share in this special event with Professor James Warwick. I hope you enjoy the evening with us, and I would like now to hand over to our Dean, Professor Elmy Miller, to please introduce the candidate.
Good evening, colleagues, students, friends, guests. It's wonderful to have you here in person and also wonderful to have some of you here online. It's a real pleasure to introduce tonight our inaugural lecture by Professor James Warwick. He's the Executive Head of the Department of Medical Imaging and Clinical Oncology, and he's also the Head of the Division of Nuclear Medicine in our faculty and here at Tygerberg Hospital. So James's journey is a fascinating one. He started with a passion for physics and applied mathematics. He studied at UCT and an undergraduate degree in this direction, and then he decided to pivot into medicine. And that scientific curiosity and rigorous thinking never left him. I think that is what informed his work in nuclear medicine, where physics actually meet with patient care. He completed his MBCHB at UCT and then trained in nuclear medicine at Stellenbosch University in our faculty. He earned a master's and a PhD here. And in this time, he also defined his career with a strong focus on education, an impressive body of research, including over 80 peer-reviewed publications as well as book chapters. And I think a very important footprint in terms of postgraduate students. Because, colleagues, this is not a big field. Not many people do nuclear medicine, but James have supervised more than 20 postgraduate students. So his footprint is not only at Stellenbosch University, but everywhere in the country where we have nuclear medicine specialists. His research has got a wide interest. He's done work in neurobiology, psychiatric illnesses, renal medicine, glomerular filtration, infectious disease, and he's going to talk to us tonight about the degree of diagnosis and treatment that comes together with radiopharmaceuticals, radiotracers, and that target specific cells like cancer cells. He's a great teacher, a generous mentor, a meticulous examiner, and a leader in medical education. He has shaped the national standards as president of the College of Nuclear Physicians for nearly a decade. I've also got to know James as a modest man with a quiet sense of humor, a love of hiking, and a love of local history. And these hobbies remind us that scientific excellence and human curiosity often go hand in hand. Tonight's lecture, titled From the Multicounter a Story of Nuclear Medicine, it's more than just a history of the field. It's a personal reflection on how innovation across disciplines, from physics to biochemistry, has shaped modern medicine. It's a glimpse into the future where precision imaging and therapy are converging to changing lives. So please join me in welcoming Professor James Warwick to the podium.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Miller. Professor Smith, acting COO, Professor Stevens, acting Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Miller, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, Professor Fielding, Dean of the Faculty of Science, and Vice Deans of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, Professor Baichis and Dr. Fish. Colleagues, friends, and family, it is really a great privilege to me tonight to have the opportunity to address you on this subject. The field of nuclear medicine has had an interesting history and originated from a number of pioneers, of innovative people, and has gone through a number of developments shaped a lot by technology to what it is today. And I hope tonight to be able to share with you a little bit of that. As Professor Miller said, I have a very amateurish interest in history, and I'm not going to be able to give you a rigorous historical lecture tonight, so any bias or any omissions are completely my own, but I hope that you enjoy it. So maybe something I just need to get out of the way first of all, because I think it helps to understand the lecture coming up, is there are 3 radiation-based medical specialities. And often I find members both outside and even within the medical community don't understand the difference between the two. And I think it helps, just by way of setting the scene, to understand a little bit better what these are. The field of radiation oncology is a field where we use sealed sources of radioactivity, either outside of the patient, such as this radiotherapy machine here, or inside the patient, sealed sources that will be used for treatment, normally for cancers. The field of radiodiagnosis, or radiology, is a field where typically we will use radiation, whether it's X-rays or CT, in the case of CT scans, radio waves in the case of MRI, or sound waves in the case of ultrasound, and normally to get an idea of the anatomical structure primarily inside the human body. Nuclear medicine takes a completely different approach, and that nuclear medicine uses unsealed sources of radiation. So what do I mean by unsealed sources? That we will actually inject the radiation in a free chemical form into the patient so that it can move chemically throughout the body. Sometimes it's not injected, it may be inhaled, it may even be swallowed. But in this way, we're able to trace functional aspects of the body, either for the purposes of diagnosis or sometimes for therapy. So a little bit of setting the stage as well in terms of radiation. There are three types. If this represents an atom over here, where does radiation come from? Well, it comes from that little structure in the center of the atom called the nucleus. And when that nucleus is unstable, it needs to get itself into a lower energy, a more stable state, and it does so by emitting some form of radiation. And physicists, being physicists, like to name things with Greek letters. And the three primary kinds of radiation are alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha and beta radiation are small particles. So in the case of alpha, it's actually a small combination of four nucleons, two protons, two neutrons, or what we'll call a helium nucleus that is emitted. Beta radiation, it's an electron that's emitted, the same stuff that we buy from Eskom. In the case of gamma radiation, it's a very high energy form of light wave that the radiation is emitted. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, if you're going to put radiation inside the living human body, the differences between these different types of radiation matter. So in the case of alpha and beta radiation, because they're particles, they travel only a very short distance within the body before they deposit all of their energy. So that can make them useful for therapeutic purposes if you want to treat a cancer, for example, if you can get the radioactive compound into the tumor. Gamma radiation, on the other hand, is primarily escapes the body, and this makes it useful if you're able to detect it externally to form an image of the radiation in the body. So it's more useful for diagnostic type of procedures. So in the first part of the talk, I want to talk about the pioneers in this field. A lot of these were inquisitive people who played in interesting areas of science, probably weren't regarded as very important at the time, but they really set the stage. And the first person I want to talk about is George de Hevesy. And the story starts in Manchester in 1911, when George de Hevesy was a young Hungarian chemist who was hired in the lab of the very famous physicist Ernest Rutherford. And Ernest Rutherford gave him a task. He had a problem with a radioactive form of lead, lead-210, that he wanted separated from the other lead. And who better to do this than a young, up-and-coming chemist? George de Hevesy tried for 2 years and failed miserably, completely unable to chemically separate these two forms of lead. But what he realized was that this very fact that the lead-210 was just the same as the other lead from a chemical perspective meant that he was able to use it as a representative of lead in the body in general, what was called the so-called tracer principle. And this is basically the basis upon which all nuclear medicine is made. George de Hevesy may have come across this idea when, as that young student in Manchester, he grew to suspect that his landlady may be recycling some of the food in their boarding house. When he confronted her with this suspicion, she denied it. So George, being the scientist he was, brought some of his lead-210 back to the boarding house, and when he had his next meal and sent back some of it, he put a little trace of lead-210 in the food. The following day, when he received his meal, he put his electroscope on the table and proceeded to prove that the landlady was indeed recycling the food. Next person is probably someone that most of us know the least in the nuclear medicine community, and that's John Lawrence. John Lawrence was based in Berkeley in California. He had a very famous brother, Ernest Lawrence, who was the physicist who invented the cyclotron. The cyclotron is a machine that enables us to produce artificial radioactive compounds. And there was a lot of this research going on, especially under scientists such as Irene Curie, her husband, Frederic Curie-Gillet. That's the daughter of Marie Curie, by the way, also won a Nobel Prize, so one of those endlessly overachieving families, clearly. But John Lawrence, who was a physician and a physicist, he was able to get some radioactive phosphorus-13 from the cyclotron. And he noticed when performing animal work that the phosphorus 32, when injected in a colloid form, tended to concentrate in the bone marrow in rats. And after collecting enough of this data, he realized that this concentration in the bone marrow was so much that it could be useful to treat cancers that concentrate in the bone marrow. And the first targeted treatment that we know of was given sometime in the 1930s. 1936 is one date, 1939 is another. It depends on the source. But for the first time that we have a record of where a patient with chronic myeloid leukemia was treated after an injection of phosphorus 32. And that treatment, in fact, was later expanded to other blood cancers and, in fact, remained as part of the standard care of these treatments right into the 1970s and 80s, when some of the chemotherapies, the fluorouracil-based chemotherapies, replaced those treatments. But this is, in fact, the first record we have of using the tracer principles for treatment. Someone who us, certainly in the nuclear medicine community, know of more is Saul Hertz. So Saul Hertz was also an American. He was based at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He was an endocrinologist. He was the head of the thyroid clinic in the 1930s. And in 1936, the head of MIT, none other than the physicist Compton, who those of us in the nuclear medicine world know well for his scatter, he went and gave a talk to the medical school about the possible uses of these new radioactive compounds in medicine. And Dr. Hertz, at the end of the presentation, put his hand up and asked Professor Compton if it was possible to produce radioactive forms of iodine. So Professor Compton wasn't quite sure, but said he'd get back to him. The reason why he was asking is because it really was well known from physiologists from the early 20th century that the thyroid gland contains a lot of iodine. And Saul Hertz's thinking was, could you use this radioactive form of iodine to treat patients who had overactive thyroid glands? When Compton returned with the news a few days later that indeed these radioactive compounds could be produced, Saul Hertz and a colleague proceeded with a number of years of work, again animal work, where they were able to show that small animals with overactive thyroid glands concentrated a particularly high amount of this radioactive iodine. When they had collected enough data, the first human therapy on record was on one Elizabeth E., 1941, that Saul Hertz administered radioactive iodine to for her overactive thyroid gland. This was followed by a number of other patients and was rapidly shown to be a very effective kind of therapy for this challenging condition. Later on, they found that even patients with thyroid cancer in 1946 that they could treat as well with radioactive iodine with similarly successful effects. The photograph here is not a patient. The woman sitting in the chair is a colleague of Saul Hertz, but she's demonstrating the device that they use called the multicounter. And this was arguably the first attempt at producing an image in nuclear medicine. All the multicounter, in fact, was just a whole lot of Geiger counters together, and so one could measure at different points and get a kind of very crude, low-resolution image of where the radioactivity was sitting in the body. But one could argue that was the beginning of radioactive iodine in the 1940s. So this thing we're going to come back to, Theranostics, but in a sense, Saul Hertz may have been the pioneer. So the problem with radioactivity is you can't see it. In fact, it's quite difficult to detect in any way. And this creates a problem if you want to look at what's going on inside a living human body for the purpose of doing investigations, for example. So those three pioneers that I told you about, the tools that they had available to them were really very crude. The oldest and simplest was the electroscope. Maybe some of you remember from high school experiments way back, which is a very simple device that would have two gold leaves that hung at the end of it, and you would charge it up with static electricity, and the two gold leaves would spread apart from the repulsive forces of static electricity. And one of the things that they found they could use with that is if you had a form of radioactivity that emitted charged particles, like alpha or beta, those charged particles, if you held them to the little plate at the top, the charge would be lost, and slowly the gold leaves would drop. And so depending on the rate at which they dropped, you could tell how much activity there was. So that was one of the earliest tools that was available. The ionization chamber, this is one that was actually made by Pierre Curie, who's the husband and collaborator of Marie Curie. back, as you can see, in the end of the 19th century. And the way the ionization chamber worked is you would have a gas inside a sealed container. And if gamma rays went through, they would actually strip the electrons off those gas atoms. And if you had an electric field in it, you could pick up a little change in charge, and that way you could realize that you're detecting some activity. In fact, the devices that we use to this day in our lab to measure doses that we're going to administer to patients is still based on the same principle. And then, of course, I think everybody's heard of the famous Geiger-Miller counter, which Hans Geiger, this particular one he made in the 1930s. It's another device that was useful to detect low levels of radioactivity. It was based on a cascade principle. The physics of it is not that important for the purposes of this. But again, all three of these things, they were just detectors. They were nowhere near being able to get an image of what's happening within the body. Perhaps the closest thing we had to an image at that stage is this rather curious device called a spinthariscope, which was originally made by a physicist who was trying to find his very scarce iodine molecules that he had lost all over his workbench. Devised this little device that was basically a small tube with an eyepiece on one end and a little screen on the other end with zinc sulfide. And the alpha particles released by the uranium would interact with the screen and create a little flash, what we call a scintillation, so one could see where the radioactivity was. This is just a simulation of something what it would have looked like if you had this on a watch hand. But none of these devices are really at all suitable for imaging humans. So in the next period from the 1940s until the 1970s was the period when the discipline of nuclear medicine came to be established. And one of the key requirements for this period of time was the ability to image patients. And I'm going to share with you how that was done. So this pretty picture is of a set of scintillation crystals. Again, the physics of this was well known from the early 20th century, that some crystals, if you exposed them to a gamma ray, the gamma ray would actually enter the crystal, deposit all of its energy, and then convert it into a tiny little flash of light called a scintillation. What they've done in this photograph, which comes off a YouTube video, is they've taken a number of different well-known scintillation crystals for us in the nuclear medicine world, placed it on a glass sheet, but underneath that glass sheet is quite a strong gallium source of gamma rays. And so there are thousands of gamma rays hitting these crystals, creating thousands of little flashes, and so they all have these characteristic glows of different colors. So round about the time of the Second World War, this was known, and in order to detect radioactivity, one of the things that could be done is have a scintillation crystal, and literally one could manually count the flashes, and so you get an idea of how many gamma rays were striking it. And it was a young physicist called Samuel Curran who was working on the Manhattan Project in 1944, who was also based in Berkeley. And as they say, laziness is the mother of all invention. And he realized that the Radio Corporation of America at that stage produced a new photomultiplier tube, and he realized if he connected one of these, what it would do is it convert that little flash of light into a tiny electric charge, and then it would amplify that electric charge. So you actually got a strong enough signal that you could pick up on an electronic circuit. And so the first electronic scintillation counter was born. It's still a detector, but what it was able to do is it became a building block for all of the machines that came after that, and was exquisitely sensitive. And so it was the first real detector that was designed to work within these kind of systems. But it was a team at UCLA that made the first attempt to actually create an image in a patient. And the way they did it initially was very, very rudimentary. What they did is they took one of these scintillation counters, focused it very well so that they could look at just a small area. And in the case of this patient, they were imaging his thyroid gland. What they did is set out an initial grid of 20 by 20 points, so 400 points, and each one would be painstakingly measured. And so you could get an idea of what the thyroid looked like on that plot. This would be moved manually from point to point. A scan would take 1 to 2 hours. But that was the beginning of nuclear imaging. So Ben Casson, who was the leader of the team at UCLA, very quickly started to automate this process. So the first thing they did is they realized, well, if you'd linked your connector mechanically to a little tapping device, a little electronic tapping device that would tap each time there was a little pulse of electricity, and you put that on a typewriter ribbon and a paper underneath, and then you scanned back and forth, you could start to generate an image. And so the rectilinear scanner was born in 1950. And these machines soon became commercially available. They were the engineers got stuck into them and made them better. They had better crystals, better collimators. All of the systems to reproduce images got better. And in fact, they were the machines that completely dominated imaging in nuclear medicine right through the 1950s, 1960s, and even as late as 1973, the rectilinear scanner was producing something like 2.5 million scans in the United States alone. In fact, the photograph on the right was taken at Tygerberg Hospital, and Professor Elman, who I'm so happy to see here tonight, she remembers in her early days that we were still doing liver scans at Tygerberg Hospital. At this stage, again, it's a staged photo. The patient is, in fact, one of our radiographers. And this scan would take about 20 minutes to produce, a simple two-dimensional scan, but that was the way that you would scan a liver in the 1960s and 70s, before the advent of other imaging techniques. However, there was someone else who was a friend, actually, of Ben Casson, a very sort of understated scientist called Hull Anger, who was also based at Berkeley. Apparently, right to the end of his life, he just described himself as someone who liked to make things. And make things he did. A remarkable contribution to the field of nuclear medicine during his life. And if I just start with the well counter, for example, in 1950, this is a device where the problem that Hull Anger was dealing with there is that if he wants to measure really tiny amounts of radioactivity, he realized you need to almost put it inside the crystal so you could catch all of the radiation going in all directions. And being quite a practical person, what he did is he literally drilled a hole in the scintillation crystal and connected it to the photomultiplier tube in the same way. And so the well counter was born. These machines we still use to this day, and in fact, if I think of the doctoral work that Jen Holness did in our department during the 2010s, and now that Beth McConnell is doing for her PhD, these are the machines that we use to measure the blood samples, do accurate measurements of renal function. But Hull Anger is not famous for the well counter. What he's really famous for is what's called the Anger camera, or the gamma camera. And this was an ingenious breakthrough that he made a few years after Ben Casson invented his rectilinear scanner. So the way that Hull Anger thought of doing this was that instead of measuring one little place at a time to build up an image, is why not have a big crystal that covers the whole organ, and then have a battery of photomultiplier tubes packed in a sort of hexagonal pattern over it. And what the genius of this device was that through analog electronics, he was able to not only detect that there was a flash in the crystal, but was able to get its position. And this positioning logic, so that one could then have a crystal, not only do you detect it, but you can get an X and a Y coordinate, all done with analog electronics at that stage in the 1950s. And this meant that you were able to image an entire organ or organ system at the same time. So it was no longer necessary to count, and the scanning time became a lot shorter. Suddenly it became possible to do dynamic scans where you could actually see things moving in real time, and in that sense was absolutely revolutionary. Interestingly, it took a long time for the medical community to fully adopt the gamma camera. It was only really in the 1970s that the gamma camera overtook the rectilinear scanner. So while all this was going on, there was a much smaller fringe group of, let's say, scientists in the medicine field. So there's one other kind of radioactive decay I didn't tell you about. I spoke about beta decay when an electron comes out, but there's a thing called beta plus decay when what's called a positron is emitted instead of an electron. A positron is a form of antimatter. In other words, it is an entire other universe of matter that exists that is a corresponding component to each of the elements of matter that we know. So what makes antimatter really interesting from an imaging point of view, or the positron really interesting, is that the positron also, after it leaves the atom, moves a very short distance through the body and then it needs to interact with the human body what it does, it interacts, it finds its matter opposite, an electron. And the two of them then, in a state of relative rest, they will combine with each other and mutually completely annihilate one another. But now that energy's got to go somewhere, because the E equals mc squared, you remember that formula, that energy from those two particles has to go somewhere. But the problem is you can't send it out as one photon, because the momentum of the system then won't be zero, because remember these two things were standing still. So nature solves the problem by sending two photons in opposite directions, so that the overall momentum of the system remains zero. Now, why am I going on about all of this? Well, what's interesting about this is from an imaging perspective. This means if you set up two detectors on opposite sides and then have some electronics to make sure the two flashes come from the same event, you're now able to locate the position of it, not from one point, but from two. And this has got a lot of advantages in terms of more accurate physical location. So these two researchers back in the 1950s, they were really fringe, these guys. Brownell and Sweet, they were working back at Massachusetts General Hospital, in fact. And this is a scan they did at that stage in a patient with a brain tumor. They were using a compound called arsenic 79. And you could see this very, very basic scan where they were able to detect an event using positron coincidence technology. So by the end of the 1960s, round about the time I was born, nuclear medicine had become quite an established discipline. It had found its place together with radiology. They complemented one another. Though there are lots of scans one could do, thyroid scan to look for overactive thyroids or thyroid nodules. Brain scans, you could detect strokes or you could detect brain tumors, for example. Each time using a different chemical. This one, you would use something that would enter into the brain matter. Liver and spleen scanning you could do with this colloid, so you were able to get scans of the liver, like the one I showed you earlier. If you use something else, like Epuran, you could scan the kidneys, and you could look at the function of the two kidneys compared to each other. And Prof. Miller, you might be interested to see this is an early renogram of a transplanted kidney from 1965, from New England Journal of Medicine, probably one of the first. Lung scans as well, you could look at the blood flow to the lungs and you could look at the airflow to the lungs by inhaling, and then if you've got an area where there's no blood going, that will tell you you're likely to have a clot in the lungs, or what we call a pulmonary embolism, potentially a very serious condition. So the discipline had a very comfortable place in the medical world. It was one of the specialities, fitted in well with radiology, lots of stuff nuclear medicine could do that no one else could do. The images were simple. They were, as you can see, very low resolution. They were all two-dimensional. And then the 1970s arrived. And the 1970s and 1980s were a revolutionary period in medical imaging. Not so much because of what was going on in nuclear medicine. There were developments, which I'll share with you in a moment. But in the field of radiology, there were some really revolutionary things going on. Ultrasound, which had actually originated from the 1950s, originally mostly in obstetrics to look at the fetus. In the 1970s and 80s, started moving into mainstream radiology, starting to image all kinds of structures in the body. And many of the original scans, like the liver scan that nuclear medicine had, could be replaced by a much more effective ultrasound scan. The CT scan, which, if not born, was certainly conceived in this very city in the late 1950s. By the early 1970s, the first commercial model started to appear. And the availability of this rolled out quickly in the 1970s and 80s. Similarly, in the 1980s, MRI scans, which were based on using radio waves of the patient in a strong magnetic field. And you could see immediately, even these very early examples of these scans, I mean, the anatomical resolution is fantastic. And it was completely revolutionizing the way that imaging was being done. And many of the old nuclear medicine investigations were starting to become obsolete and were having to be rethought. So there were some developments going on during the 60s and during the 70s and 80s as well. So there's this very interesting compound, technetium-99m. And you find it interesting. It's something sitting rather randomly in the middle of the periodic table, but it really is a very useful compound from the perspective of nuclear medicine. The first thing is it produces a pure gamma ray at just the right energy for the gamma camera, so it's really great for imaging quality. But the really useful thing about it is that from early work at Brookhaven Laboratories in New York from the 50s and then developed during the 60s, was that one was able to devise this thing called a generator. So what made a generator so special is that you basically, for a 2-week period, you could have this technetium in the form of a technetium pertechnetate solution coming out in saline. You could have it on tap. So it's almost like ordering your wine in a box instead of by the glass. And this completely opened up the option, because previously, the radioisotopes had to come from a cyclotron or it had to come from a reactor, and it limited what you could do. But especially when combined that with the fact that if you combined this pertechnetate solution with different chemicals, you suddenly had a vast array of different kinds of investigations that you can do. And really, depending on the chemical you stuck it onto, you could do different things. So for me personally, for example, if you combine it with a chemical called HMPAO, you're able to get a functional image of brain blood flow, which tells you about brain function. So in my doctoral work that I did during the early 2000s, I was using SPECT scans, which I will explain a little bit more later, using technetium-99m to look at brain function in patients with social phobia, for example. But in the same way, you could do lung scans if you injected particles or later on did a gas. If you used another chemical, you could look at the function of the liver. Something else again, you could look at kidney function and measure the function of both kidneys or the function of kidneys on their own. If you used a colloid scan, you could see if there was, or if you used damaged red cells or colloid scan, you could look at the function of the spleen. If you labeled the red cells, you could do a very accurate measurement of heart function. Indeed, this is a test we still do to this day in patients who are due to get chemotherapy. You could look at white cells and find areas of infection. Or you could look at label a phosphonate with technetium, and you could do a bone scan to detect, for example, early disease, early cancer spread, for example, to the skeleton. In fact, in our department, we even do a radioactive egg sandwich. I'm serious. If you want to look at emptying of the stomach, we have a standardized meal where we radio label an egg sandwich, and we know exactly how quickly that should be cleared out. So you can label just about anything. Okay, then the other important development that was taking place during this time, and this is really starting to move into the period that I have recollection, and that was the move from 2D images to 3D images. So we know already with the CT scan, for example, that if you take a single X-ray, such as this one on the left, if you take a whole lot of X-rays all around the patient over 360 degrees and then combine them with a combination of mathematics and powerful computing, you can build a 3-dimensional image of the entire space that's got much more information in it, much more valuable for the detection of disease. And a group at the University of Pennsylvania realized, well, you can do exactly the same thing with a gamma camera scan. You needed a gamma camera at this stage, not a rectilinear scanner. And so the 3-dimensional nuclear imaging, what we call not CT but SPECT, single photon emission computed tomography, but the SPECT scan was born. And this brought the same advantages that the CT brought to X-ray. You're able to see see structures 3-dimensionally. Things are no longer hiding behind things. You get much better contrast. And so that one of the shifts in nuclear medicine in the modern era has been away from the old 2-dimensional planar imaging towards this 2-dimensional SPECT. So just to give you one example, in about 2012, we made the transition in our department for lung scans, which had been around for donkey's years, as you saw those examples I showed from way back. And in the beginning, with the typical conservatism of doctors, we didn't feel comfortable just to jump straight into SPECT. So we carried on doing what we felt safe with our 2-dimensional planar scans. And then we did SPECT as well. Now, this is a case that I kept from the time because it really told me a story. So this is a picture of blood flow to the lungs. And you'd be forgiven for saying, well, there's probably nothing there. There may be something subtle going on there. It's really rather iffy, right? But this very same patient, and this is just one slice at the level of that, if you miss that, then you shouldn't be doing nuclear medicine. So the enhanced contrast of what it brings to improving your investigation is huge. And then remember those PET guys doing the brain scan back in the early 50s. Well, a little group of hardcore enthusiasts kept going with PET, particularly at the University of Washington in St. Louis. And they realized they could do tomography as well if they put their detectors in a ring and then detect multiple events. And they worked specifically on imaging of the brain. So they made this brain PET scanner. You can see it's just big enough for the patient to lie with their head in. And what really helped them was in 1976, the Brookhaven laboratories produced a molecule called FDG. The FDG, or fluorodeoxyglucose, is just radioactive sugar. So by taking a glucose molecule and radiolabeling it, this was really good for brain imaging because the brain uses a lot of sugar. And so at that stage, PET was used by, it was kind of it hadn't gone mainstream by all means, but it was very much becoming a neurology tool with a group of enthusiastic researchers. And you can see, as these PET scanners evolved over time, this images of the brain were starting to get better and better as time went on. So then the last period I want to talk about is a period during when I really entered the field. And one of the things that I picked up on immediately that really made a big difference was this PET started moving beyond being just a brain imaging agent to becoming an oncological agent. And so there's the molecule. It's a little glucose molecule with a radioactive fluorine on it, but it's treated in many ways very similar to ordinary sugar by the body. And it had been known since the 1930s, what was called the Warwick effect, was that tumor tissues often concentrated a lot of sugar. That's something that we knew. And so somebody busy, aware of this new molecule, FDG, realized that this may be useful in tumors as well. And in fact, in 1994, the FDA approved FDG for the first time for a number of cancers. And very quickly what we realized is that with PET scanning of the body, there were many cancers which at that stage were often difficult to detect, that what PET could detect very well. And the impact of this was that sometimes up to 40% of patients were being treated differently when they had a PET scan, because often, for example, one would find disease that was too subtle to detect on other imaging, and suddenly the entire management strategy changed. So when I was a newly qualified specialist and I had the opportunity to travel to Belgium, the universities of Leuven and Ghent, I went there to do some brain work, and I learned some brain analysis, but I couldn't fail to see, because the Belgians were ahead of the curve on us, their number of PET scans that they were doing every day in patients in oncology. And it was that stage that I realized there was a big future here for this discipline. So similarly, during that period, the technology has evolved significantly. The engineers have got into just about everything and optimized them. This is a gamma camera, sort of 1980s vintage, a single round head. Would have mostly done 2D images. You can see it's got a very basic gantry here. It could have done SPECT, but it would have been pretty lousy SPECT. And this sort of device has been replaced today. This is a photograph of a model exactly like one we have on 10th floor in Tygerberg Hospital, where these scanners now have got big rectangular heads. They've got 2 or even 3 heads. And probably the most important thing is that they've been combined with CT scanners. But you can see now, instead of a single round image, you can now get a whole body image. And if you look, for example, at a SPECT image of the whole body, around about 2000, the penny dropped with nuclear medicine, that actually the information coming from the functional imaging and the information from the anatomical imaging, such as CT, was incredibly complementary. And so it made sense not for the two to compete against each other, but in fact to combine the two in a single scanner, which was literally 2 scanners bolted together and then the 2 images fused with each other. And I mean, I know from when we started doing PET-CT, working together with our radiology colleagues, how it was the ultimate example of synergy in medical imaging, that the information from the 2 together was far more than the 2 on their own. Similarly, the PET scanner, the very modest machine of the 1970s, today they have also evolved in just about every way imaginable in terms of engineering. And again, it was the conversion of the PET to the PET-CT, which has really, and subsequently they've been combined even with MRI imaging to give a complementary form of imaging, much more powerful than is the case if you just have the modality on its own. So if we go back to those brain scans from getting up to the 1990s. If we look at the kind of brain detail, this is in about a 2010 vintage, a good analog system, something like what we're using at Tygerberg today. But then if we go to Prof. Derator's unit, NRI, where they've got a digital imaging system, again, this is able to detect individual photons. You can see the level of the quality is really starting to get very, very high, and one's starting to get down to individual voxels that are just a millimeter in size. But probably the most exciting thing that has happened over this period has been the development of new molecules, because nuclear medicine is really all about molecules. The scan is just a way of getting a picture, but if you change the molecule, you get a whole new scan. You get whole new information. So, just to give you a few examples, and these are, with the exception of one of them, these are all coming out of our unit at Tygerberg Hospital. The scan on the left, for example, in a woman is a woman with cervix cancer. But what we're imaging in this case is not the cancer, but an area of the cancer which has got low oxygen in it, what we call hypoxia. And why is it interesting to know if there's an area of a tumor that's got low oxygen in it? Because typically that's an area of the tumor that'll be or radiotherapy. And so if you have a tracer that's able to show you hypoxic areas, that's got the potential to allow your radiation oncologist to target it more aggressively and achieve a greater level of cure. So this is an image at the moment. Celeste Berger is working towards her doctoral work, and this is an image from a study she's busy with from one of our Tygerberg patients. Similarly, and of course brain scanning is something that's remained an interest of mine. We've moved from the SPECT work that I did in my doctoral work. Alex Derator, 10 years or so later, did doctoral work using PET work, also in social anxiety disorder, but much better quality images, better analyses also with MRI work. And so we were able to image brain function using in this case, FDG, which is still very useful because it gives an indication of which areas of the brain are working or which areas are inflamed. This is an image actually from doctoral work that Bianca Berndorf is working on at the moment in neurolupus, and we've got some spectacular results that have been recently published in neurolupus. But the thing is, you can change the molecule and we can look at something else. So if you look at this image over here, for example, we now shift to looking at dopamine in the brain. It's an important chemical for brain messaging. And dopamine using F-dopa PET is particularly useful in patients with Parkinson's syndromes, for example. So you change the compound, you've got a whole new scan. This scan is not from us at this stage. We don't have this compound available to us yet, but this is a patient with Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease, part of that degeneration is you actually get proteins laid down in the brain that are then the cause of the underlying disease. And you can actually image those proteins using a PET tracer. And so this is actually a patient with quite advanced disease where there's a high level of deposition. But you can look at the heart as well. So these are images from our unit, for example, where the tracer at the top we use to look at blood flow to the heart. So you can see a whole area in the front of this patient's heart which has got almost no blood flow. So there's two possible explanations for this scenario. The one could be that he's had a huge infarct and actually this tissue is dead and there's not really much you could do to help you other than a heart transplant. Okay. The other possibility, though, is that the human heart has an ability to go into a kind of load shedding. It's got the ability, especially when it's got low oxygen, to shift its fuel from fat, which needs lots of oxygen, to burning sugar, which it's able to burn without the need for oxygen. And this is what we call myocardial hibernation. So what it does is it just hangs in there. It doesn't pump, it doesn't do anything, it just stays alive. And why is that important for us? Because from a clinical point of view, if you're able to bypass and get blood flow back to that part of the heart, it can recover. And it's very, one of the great ways of seeing this kind of process is by doing molecular imaging that then allows you to see actually what's happening functionally in the heart on a molecular level. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is this rather difficult portmanteau, Theranostics, which is a kind of conglomeration of therapy and diagnostics. The concept's actually not new. The word is relatively new because, as I mentioned earlier, in fact, if you look at thyroid disease and you go back 80 years to the work of Saul Hertz, he was, in a sense, doing a simple form of Theranostics, and certainly subsequently we were doing it. So the idea behind Theranostics is you have a tracer which is going to go and look, for example, and find a certain tumor. If you use one kind of isotope that's a gamma emitter, you can use it for imaging, for diagnostic work. If you change that to another isotope, which is, for example, a beta emitter, you can then use it for therapy. So the same tracer, but you change the isotope and you change the function of what you do. So in thyroid tissue, for example, now we know the thyroid is a gland in our neck. It's essential for all of us, and it produces a hormone which contains a lot of iodine. So to get that iodine, the cells in the thyroid have these little pumps that actually pump the iodine into the cells that they can use it to make there. And that's exactly the property that Saul Hertz used all those years ago. So normally if we get iodine from our salt, for example, that'll be normal stable iodine. But if you use one isotope, iodine 123, it's a gamma emitter, you can get an image. And if you use iodine 131, which is a gamma and beta emitter, then you can use the betas for treatment. And in fact, this treatment of thyroid cancer, whether it's cancer or whether it's an overactive thyroid, I mean, in our thyroid clinic any Thursday, Nisa Korolev will be treating probably half a dozen patients with overactive thyroid glands. In fact, a few years ago, I took one of our animals to the vet, and making idle conversation, the vet asked me what I did. I said I was a nuclear physician, expecting a kind of glazed over and slightly bemused look. He knew exactly what I did. That's because he had dealt with colleagues. So overactive thyroid is something that's quite common in cats, and it's actually one of the treatments that is now used in veterinary science. And we learnt through the 1970s that you didn't just have to be a single atom. You could stick it onto a tracer molecule. So, for example, neuroblastoma, which is quite a nasty tumor that is typically found in small children, that the tumor tissue here concentrates this chemical. So if you label it with iodine, this thing called meta-iodobenzyl guanidine, doesn't really matter, we call it MIBG. If you use iodine 123 again, you could get an image. If you use iodine 131, you could image and you can treat. And as we go into the 2000s, probably the next molecule that came along in the theranostic world is in some of these what are called neuroendocrine tumors. These are patients who often can live for a long time, but quality of life is often not great because many of these tumors secrete various substances. And what we learned about these tumors is they often typically express a thing called a somatostatin receptor, a protein on the surface. And if you can find a molecule that binds to that somatostatin receptor and you radiolabel it, you can radiolabel it with gallium and you can get a PET scan. And you can see all these little spots in the bottom of the abdomen there is tumor. But then if you label it with lutetium, you're able to treat it. And this has resulted in significant improvement in the quality of life of these patients. Maybe the last molecule I'll talk about in terms of the contemporary period is this one. It's because it's a big deal just in terms of the importance of the cancer in terms of the number of people affected, and that's prostate cancer. And prostate cells and cancer cells express another protein called prostate-specific antigen on its cell surface. And there's again a molecule that binds to PSMA that you can radiolabel. And what this has then allowed us to do, for example, again, using gallium, we can get a PET scan. You'll see in this patient there's some little spots which are actually lymph nodes inside the pelvis of this patient. If you look on the CT scan, you'd be forgiven for missing those tiny little 4 millimeter nodes. I mean, my radiology colleagues would agree normally if it's that size, you don't worry too much about it. But you can see when you look at the expression of the PSMA that these light up like little candles, that you're able to detect minute quantities of disease, and this allows you to manage these patients optimally. And if one then labels the PSMA with lutetium-177 beta emitter, you're able to also do therapy. And at this stage, these treatments are particularly valuable in men who are towards the end stage of the disease, often have inoperable disease, often producing a significant improvement in their quality of life, and even extending it as well. And I was very pleased a couple of weeks ago at Celeste Berger in our department. We've done PSMA scans in Professor Elman's time. She did the first ones in private patients. But I think it was Celeste for the first time we were able to treat a state patient with this therapy. And we are hoping to treat some more with the limited budget we have available. So I really just some concluding comments of where I think the future is headed. I think nuclear medicine is in a great space. I think the development of new molecules is the primary thing. Of course, there's going to be a continual development in technology. I was at a meeting this last weekend up in Gauteng, and AI, of course, is the buzzword and everything it is to in nuclear medicine. And at the moment, there are manufacturers using AI to improve the quality of the images, to help with the doctor with making better diagnoses. There's even using AI to use the camera more efficiently in terms of the number of patients that you use. But I think undoubtedly it always comes back to the most exciting thing is new compounds. And the talking point amongst us in the nuclear medicine community at the moment is this thing called FARPI. So typically when you get a tumor, it's not just made of tumor cells, it's got other cells in it as well, like fibroblasts, and these fibroblasts very often express a protein, or a fibroblast activation protein. If you have a molecule that binds to that, you've got potentially an absolutely fantastic tool to image and treat many new tumors. So the images at the top, these are of the same two patients. This is done with FGG, which of course has been our old go-to for many, many years. And the same patients, if you see the imaging with FARPI, you're getting much better uptake, much more intense uptake. So not only potentially much better scans for diagnosis, but potentially treatments of a whole new set of cancers. So this is very exciting. So really just in closing, a couple of comments that I'd like to point out. I mean, the one thing that I thought about when I was preparing this work, and particularly the work of the early pioneers in this field, it was obviously a world that was very limited in its access at that time. Just about everybody doing that work were men. They were just about all Americans. But that was where the technology was available at the time. And one of the things that's very pleasing to me today, if I take as an example the unit where we train, we now have a diversity of students from South Africa and in fact from many parts of Africa who are now also getting an opportunity to get exposure to this technology and potentially to make their own contributions, which is of course the way it should be. The other thing that struck me is how research sometimes the research work that one does is maybe not the big science, maybe not the things that everyone is saying you must do. But if you look at those early pioneers, they pursued something that they believed in. And I think there's a place for that in any researcher. If you really believe for it, go for it, because the potential is something like that can turn into something much bigger. And you'll have setbacks. If you look at how de Hevesy initially failed in his attempt to separate lead, but actually when he reframed the problem and thought about it, how he actually came upon the incredible tracer principle, which is the basis of everything that we do today. And I think it's important to have fun when you're doing research. If I think of Hull Anger, he apparently right till the end of his life was an incredibly humble man, and for him he was just making things, and that's I think also very important in a way. So in closing, I just want to say that in the almost 30 years that I've been at Tygerberg Hospital, I've been incredibly lucky. I arrived here in my late 20s knowing absolutely nothing about nuclear medicine. I was very lucky to fall under the mentorship of a number of great mentors, from the late Professor Johannes Klopper, who was the head of department at that time, to Ben van Heerden, who was one of my consultants, and then Annerie Elman, who was also one of my consultants and one of my teachers, and later a colleague when I worked under her in her department. I learnt an enormous amount from a great scientist like Dan Stein, for example, who's now the head of psychiatry at UCT, who co-supervised my PhD, and also from a great colleague and friend to this day, Patrick Dupont, who I met on that fellowship 25 years ago, and we still work together to this day. I also want to thank all of my colleagues, both within the department. I think I'm very lucky in the division of nuclear medicine right now. We've got a very young team, very dynamic. They're very, very smart. They're an inspiring bunch of people to work with. I've been very, very lucky in that sense. Also to my colleagues in the wider department and in the wider faculty, so much of nuclear medicine is about communicating with our colleagues and explaining what we can do, what we can't do. And I know we get great collaboration with our colleagues in the rest of the faculty and even elsewhere in the country. And lastly, special thanks to my family, to Laurie and to Emily, to Scott, to Fern, my friends who came out this evening. Laurie went over to Belgium with me 25 years ago with a very small baby, and we walked that road together. So I think none of this is possible without that kind of support. So with that, my thanks to all of you.
Good evening, everyone. Wenan, Mweni. Thank you for delivering such an engaging lecture, Professor Warwick, and congratulations. It was excellently done. As we were reminded earlier tonight, an inaugural lecture serves as a platform for both the faculty and the university to acknowledge the esteemed status of a senior colleague. But of course, it also provides an opportunity for the family and the friends of people to come together. And we don't always have that wonderful opportunity in academia. I must admit that upon initial reading of the lecture topic, I felt somewhat intimidated. And I believe perhaps Professor Stevens as well, we are definitely unfamiliar with these concepts, fundamental concepts that you have described tonight. Alpha, beta, gamma, unsealed radiation, really very intimidating. But this prompted me to recall Rutherford's contention that I have come across in the past. He said, of course, that what is not physics is simply stamp collecting, and that what is not measurable is not science. And I must admit that I felt that up to now I must have been stamp collecting. But how relieved I am that we now approach societal problems with a much more integrated approach. And I really appreciated your focus on cross-disciplinary work. A master in his field, of course, has a responsibility to enlighten others, even those with limited background knowledge. And I definitely feel more informed and enlightened after this inaugural this evening. I did not know that you have an interest in history. This famous inaugural lecture, Lord Acton, who was talking about the history of modern history, noted that in an ideal scientific study there must always be reference to something that begins at a certain point in time, which is marked off by a very evident and intelligible line from the time described immediately preceding, and displaying in its course specific and very distinctive characteristics. Tonight's lecture offered a very comprehensive view of such a timeline, an overview of the evolution of the speciality of nuclear medicine. It encompassed the pioneers up to 1941, the atomic age up to the 1970s, the new era ushered in the 1980s, and then, of course, the more recent era that has witnessed new growth and integration. Professor Warwick referenced developments and advancements in equipment, imaging, processes, diagnostics, and therapies, providing a personal perspective on the origins and the evolution of nuclear medicine. With such insight, knowledge, and dedication to the discipline, the ground is fertile for further cross-disciplinary and technological innovations. As academics, we have the privilege of what has been termed the sublime art of investigating facts and occurrences, of discerning truth from falsehood and certainty from doubt, in order for our research to strengthen, straighten, and extend the mind. So on behalf of the SU community, James, I extend my best wishes to you for the practice of this sublime art and, of course, for the successful completion and continuation of your academic journey. I would like to present formally the certificate to you, now very nicely packaged, if I may.
Thank you.
Congratulations. And if I understand correctly, Dr. Fish will now conclude the Professor Baiki. There we go.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. Thank you very much, Professor Warwick. This was truly fascinating to walk the journey across the last century with you, and we look forward to walking along the rest of the road. Colleagues, friends, and family, we have reached the end of this evening's formal proceedings. All that remains is now for me to thank the organizers, especially Megan Salon at our marketing team, Jonathan Dale at the Registrar's Division, Amira Brown and Chuma Diakala at CCMD, Justin Alberts and Shane Martin for the streaming, and AV assistants and all the other departments that make events such as these such a success. With this, I declare the proceedings closed. I invite you now for some refreshments in the Dean's reception, which is just down the passage. Thank you so much for coming. Please drive safely when you head home. But at this moment, if I can ask you to stand while the procession leaves the room. Thank you.